There are seasons when your life becomes quieter than you expected, and your first instinct is to assume something has gone wrong. The conversations become fewer, invitations become less frequent, familiar routines lose their ability to satisfy you, and even the places that once felt like home begin to feel strangely temporary. Most people experience this as loss because they measure their lives by what remains visible around them. They rarely consider that what has disappeared from their environment may have simply made room for something that could not emerge while everything remained crowded. Isolation often arrives wearing the clothing of abandonment, yet its deeper work begins long before its purpose is recognized. Much of what you have called your personality was assembled through constant feedback from other people. Every reaction taught you which version of yourself felt safest to present, which opinions earned acceptance, which emotions needed to remain hidden, and which ambitions sounded reasonable enough to avoid criticism. Without realizing it, your nervous system learned to orient itself toward the surrounding field before it ever consulted its own inner movement. This adaptation was intelligent because belonging once meant survival. But what protects survival does not always protect becoming. When the surrounding voices begin to fade, many discover they no longer know which thoughts are actually their own. The silence feels uncomfortable, not because silence is painful, but because borrowed identities require continuous reinforcement. The absence of reinforcement creates uncertainty. Suddenly, preferences become difficult to identify. Desires feel unfamiliar. Even certainty itself seems to disappear for a time. What many mistake for losing themselves is often the first opportunity they have ever had to meet themselves without constant interruption. Isolation is not merely the absence of people, it is the temporary removal of echoes. Every environment reflects something back to you. Every conversation reminds you of a particular version of yourself. Every expectation quietly asks you to continue playing a role that others have already learned how to recognize. When enough of those mirrors disappear simultaneously, something remarkable begins to happen. You are no longer being reminded who you have always been, and because of that, you become available to discover who you are becoming. This is why periods of solitude often feel strangely disorienting before they become peaceful. Your mind continues searching for familiar reference points even after those reference points have vanished. It reaches toward old conversations that are no longer happening. It imagines explanations for why others have become distant. It wonders whether it should return to old environments simply to restore a sense of normality. The discomfort is real, but it is not necessarily evidence that the season is wrong. It is often evidence that your orientation system is being recalibrated. Imagine compressing a spring. While pressure increases, movement appears to decrease. From the outside, nothing exciting seems to be happening. In fact, the spring looks more restricted than before. Yet everyone understands that compression is storing potential rather than eliminating it. Consciousness behaves similarly. There are seasons when your visible life contracts while invisible capacity quietly accumulates beneath the surface. Judging that season only by external activity would completely misunderstand what is actually taking place. Human beings often confuse expansion with immediate increase. More relationships, more opportunities, more recognition, more movement, more accomplishments. Yet many of the greatest expansions begin by removing options rather than multiplying them. When unnecessary movement becomes impossible, deeper movement becomes unavoidable. Attention that once scattered itself across countless distractions begins gathering into a single coherent current. What once leaked in every direction slowly starts flowing with surprising force. This explains why some of your most important realizations never arrive during your busiest years. Activity can occupy every available corner of awareness. Constant stimulation leaves very little room for subtle perception. The deeper movements of consciousness rarely compete with noise because they do not need to. They simply wait until enough space has become available. Isolation creates that space, although not always comfortably. The very emptiness you try to escape may be the condition your deeper understanding has been waiting for. Notice what happens after enough days pass without constant distraction. Memories begin surfacing that seemed forgotten for years. Questions you avoided quietly return without accusation. Old decisions reveal motivations you could not previously recognize. You start noticing patterns that once appeared unrelated. Your own history slowly reorganizes itself into something more understandable. Nothing external has necessarily changed, yet your relationship to your entire life begins changing from within. This is not because solitude magically grants wisdom. It is because uninterrupted attention finally becomes possible. Wisdom has always required sustained observation, and sustained observation is difficult when consciousness is continually redirected toward external demands. Isolation removes many of those demands at once. At first, this feels empty because your attention has nowhere familiar to go. Then, gradually, it discovers that it can finally turn inward without immediately being called back outward again. There is another movement occurring beneath all of this that many people never recognize. During isolation, your emotional dependence upon familiar environments begins weakening. You discover that peace cannot permanently depend upon particular people remaining nearby. Purpose cannot rely upon constant encouragement. Identity cannot survive by endlessly borrowing certainty from surrounding approval. These realizations are rarely comfortable because they dismantle invisible agreements you never consciously knew you had made. Yet every agreement that dissolves returns a portion of your own authority back to you. This is why genuine solitude eventually produces a quieter confidence than constant affirmation ever could. Affirmation says, "You are valuable because we recognize you." Solitude slowly teaches, recognition was never the source of your value. These sound similar until life removes the applause. One identity collapses without witnesses. The other continues growing whether anyone is watching or not. Isolation quietly reveals which foundation you have actually been standing upon. There are moments during these seasons when nothing seems to be happening for weeks or even months. You question whether you are stagnating. You compare your invisible process to someone else's visible progress. You wonder whether you have somehow fallen behind. Yet comparison almost always measures different stages of different journeys using the same ruler. It cannot perceive the invisible restructuring occurring beneath another person's ordinary day, and it certainly cannot measure your own. The deepest transformations often appear least impressive while they are happening. Eventually, something subtle begins changing. Situations that once exhausted you no longer possess the same influence. Conversations that once intimidated you feel surprisingly manageable. Opportunities that once seemed impossible begin appearing almost naturally. You have not forced yourself into becoming someone new. Instead, the architecture from which you respond has quietly reorganized itself. Others may call this confidence. You simply recognize that you no longer require the same external conditions in order to remain internally stable. People witnessing only this later stage often believe the breakthrough appeared suddenly. They notice your calmness, your clarity, or your willingness to take risk and assume some hidden technique created the change overnight. What they cannot see is the long season when very little appeared to be happening at all. They do not see the compression that preceded the release. They celebrate the expansion while remaining unaware that the expansion was patiently assembled inside the silence they would have tried to escape. Perhaps this is why isolation deserves a different reputation than the one it usually receives. Not every lonely season is transformative, and not every period of withdrawal is healthy. Yet there are times when life quietly reduces your external world because your internal world has become ready for a larger structure than your previous environment could comfortably support. During those moments, solitude is not punishment. It is preparation. And once you begin seeing that preparation for what it is, another question naturally begins to emerge. Not what isolation has taken from you, but what it has been carefully making room for all along. There comes a moment when the season of isolation begins producing something unexpected. The silence that once felt empty begins carrying direction. Decisions that previously required endless comparisons start arriving with unusual simplicity. You notice yourself saying no without guilt, waiting without anxiety, and moving without needing immediate reassurance that you have chosen correctly. Nothing miraculous has happened. Your inner reference point has simply become stronger than the noise that once competed with it. This is one of the quiet signs that compression has begun accomplishing its work. Pressure is not merely reducing what surrounds you, it is increasing coherence within you. Before, your attention moved toward whatever demanded it most loudly. Now, attention begins organizing itself around what genuinely matters. Life has not necessarily become easier, but your relationship to complexity has fundamentally changed because your center is no longer constantly relocating. Many people assume breakthroughs arrive as dramatic emotional experiences. They expect overwhelming certainty, powerful inspiration, or a moment that permanently divides life into before and after. Those moments do happen, but they are rarely responsible for the deepest transformation. The greater breakthrough is often far quieter. It is discovering that your way of perceiving reality has changed without asking your permission. You no longer interpret the same situations through the same architecture. Consider two people walking through identical circumstances. Both experience uncertainty, both lose familiar relationships, both encounter delayed opportunities and unanswered questions. One experiences evidence that life is abandoning them. The other experiences evidence that life is reorganizing them. The external events are nearly identical, yet the lived reality becomes entirely different because perception determines what every event is allowed to become. This is why isolation eventually becomes less about what happened around you and more about what becomes possible within you. During constant engagement, consciousness spends enormous energy maintaining continuity with yesterday's identity. It keeps explaining itself to itself. It keeps defending conclusions already reached. It keeps preserving emotional patterns simply because they have become familiar. Solitude quietly interrupts that maintenance process long enough for a new organization to emerge. Notice how often growth first appears as unfamiliarity. Your old emotional reactions no longer arrive on schedule. The conversations that once energized you feel strangely incomplete. Entertainment that previously absorbed hours now struggles to hold your attention. You are not rejecting these experiences out of superiority. They simply no longer resonate with the nervous system you are gradually becoming. The frequency has shifted before the external evidence has caught up. This stage often creates unnecessary fear because people mistake unfamiliarity for emptiness. They believe something meaningful has been lost simply because something familiar has disappeared. Yet familiarity and alignment are not the same experience. Many lives become comfortable long before they become truthful. Comfort asks very little of your future. Alignment continually introduces you to versions of yourself that yesterday could not yet recognize. There is also a hidden economy operating within consciousness that isolation quietly reveals. Every unresolved expectation consumes attention. Every relationship maintained through obligation requires energy. Every identity preserved for someone else's comfort demands continuous internal effort. Most people carry these invisible expenditures for so long that they mistake exhaustion for adulthood. They assume life simply requires feeling permanently divided. Isolation interrupts that economy. It reduces the number of psychological transactions occurring each day. Attention that was previously scattered across dozens of invisible obligations slowly returns to its source. You begin noticing that your mind feels less crowded, not because there are fewer responsibilities, but because fewer unnecessary negotiations are taking place inside you. Inner space begins appearing where constant management once existed. This reclaimed attention becomes extraordinarily creative. Not creative merely in the artistic sense, but creative in the literal sense of generating new possibilities. Solutions appear that could not previously be imagined because your awareness had been occupied maintaining existing structures. New relationships become conceivable because old emotional contracts have dissolved. Entire futures become visible that were always present but inaccessible through your previous orientation. The breakthrough is not being imported from somewhere else. It is emerging from attention that has finally become available. People sometimes describe this as becoming a different person. There is truth in that description, but it can also be misleading. The deeper movement is not replacement, it is integration. Parts of yourself that once competed for influence begin cooperating instead. The fearful part no longer has to dominate because it finally feels heard. The ambitious part no longer needs to outrun insecurity because its worth is no longer under constant negotiation. The quieter wisdom that was often ignored gradually becomes the most trusted voice in the room. Something else changes that is difficult to notice while it is happening. Your relationship with time begins softening. During seasons of fear, every delay feels like evidence that something is wrong. During seasons of integration, delay becomes information rather than accusation. You stop demanding that every unanswered question resolve immediately. You become capable of remaining inside uncertainty without immediately manufacturing conclusions simply to relieve discomfort. This patience is not passive. It is the stability of a consciousness that no longer panics in open space. Because of this, opportunities begin meeting a different version of you. It is tempting to believe life suddenly became more generous, yet much of what has changed is your ability to perceive and receive what was previously overlooked. Fear narrows perception toward immediate survival. Inner coherence widens perception toward meaningful possibility. The world itself may look unchanged to everyone else. To you, it has become unexpectedly larger because more of it has become visible. Others may misunderstand this transformation. Some will assume you have become distant because you no longer participate in familiar emotional cycles. Others may believe you have changed your priorities too quickly. A few may even try to remind you of who you used to be because that version was easier for them to understand. Their reactions do not necessarily come from resistance. They often come from continuity. They are relating to the last completed version of you while you are already living from one they have not yet learned to recognize. This is why every genuine breakthrough carries an element of solitude even after isolation has ended. There are perspectives that cannot immediately be translated. There are forms of peace that sound like indifference until they are experienced directly. There are quiet convictions that no longer require agreement in order to remain steady. The compression may have concluded, yet the structure it produced continues unfolding long afterward through ordinary conversations, ordinary decisions, and ordinary days that gradually reveal themselves to have been anything but ordinary. And perhaps this explains why some seasons only become understandable in hindsight. While living inside them, you naturally focused on what seemed absent. Looking back, you begin recognizing that absence was never the central event. The central event was the invisible architecture being assembled beneath your awareness while nothing appeared to be happening. Once you begin seeing life through that possibility, even the next period of silence begins asking a different question. Not whether anything is happening, but what deeper coherence is quietly learning how to take its next shape. The deepest change produced by isolation is not that you become stronger than other people. It is that you become less divided within yourself. Much of human exhaustion is not created by work, responsibility, or difficulty. It is created by living in constant negotiation between who you are becoming and who you believe you must continue pretending to be. Every day spent maintaining that negotiation consumes attention. Every compromise repeated long enough begins feeling like personality instead of adaptation. Isolation interrupts that negotiation by removing enough external pressure that the quieter voice within you can finally complete its sentence. This explains why authentic breakthrough often feels surprisingly ordinary. There is no dramatic announcement inside your mind declaring that transformation has arrived. Instead, you simply begin living differently before realizing that you have changed. You stop reaching for distractions that once felt necessary. You stop rehearsing conversations that will probably never happen. You stop trying to predict every possible outcome before allowing yourself to begin. What once required tremendous effort gradually becomes your natural way of moving through the day. Many people wait to feel fearless before trusting themselves. Yet fearlessness is rarely the gift that follows isolation. What often emerges instead is something much more stable. You discover that fear no longer has exclusive authority over your decisions. It still speaks, but it no longer governs. It becomes one voice within a much larger conversation rather than the voice that determines the entire direction of your life. That quiet redistribution of authority changes everything. Notice how this alters your relationship with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty demanded immediate answers because unanswered questions felt unsafe. After enough inner integration, uncertainty begins resembling open terrain instead of danger. You no longer feel obligated to fill every silence with explanation or every delay with pessimism. Possibility itself becomes easier to inhabit because your nervous system no longer interprets the unknown as automatic threat. This freedom is subtle, yet it reshapes nearly every future decision. You may also notice that your relationships begin changing in unexpected ways, not because you deliberately distance yourself from others, but because your way of participating has become different. You become less interested in conversations that endlessly recycle frustration without movement. You become more attentive to honesty than agreement. You find yourself appreciating presence more than performance. Some relationships naturally deepen because they can meet this new way of being. Others quietly fall away because they depended upon the version of you that no longer requires constant reinforcement. This is not rejection. It is resonance becoming easier to recognize. During earlier seasons, loneliness often tempted you to confuse availability with compatibility. Any connection seemed preferable to emptiness because emptiness itself felt threatening. Yet isolation slowly teaches that inner emptiness and outer solitude are not the same experience. Once your inner life becomes inhabited, solitude loses much of its fear. From that place, relationships become invitations rather than necessities, expressions rather than survival strategies. There is another movement that becomes visible only after enough time has passed. You begin recognizing that many events you once called interruptions were actually redirections. The opportunity that disappeared prevented you from building your future around something too small. The relationship that ended exposed parts of yourself that comfort had quietly concealed. The delay that frustrated you created conditions that your earlier impatience would have destroyed. Looking backward, what once appeared fragmented begins revealing an unexpected continuity. This does not mean every painful experience was desirable. Pain remains pain. Loss remains loss. Grief deserves its own honesty rather than being rushed into meaning. Yet meaning often becomes visible after grief has been fully lived rather than prematurely explained. Isolation gives that process room to unfold without demanding immediate conclusions. In doing so, it transforms suffering from something merely endured into something that gradually becomes intelligible. Perhaps this is why compression cannot be hurried. Imagine opening a seed before it has completed its hidden work beneath the soil. From the outside, it appears inactive, yet invisible organization is already underway. Force the process too early, and you destroy the very structure you hope to accelerate. Human consciousness unfolds through a similar patience. Much of what appears to be waiting is actually construction occurring beyond the reach of immediate observation. There comes a point when you stop asking when life will return to what it was before. That question quietly disappears because you no longer desire the life you once wanted back. Not because you resent it, but because you have outgrown the architecture that previously supported it. What once felt expansive now feels too narrow for the awareness you have developed. This realization is one of the clearest signs that genuine breakthrough has already begun. The future no longer feels like an escape from the past. It feels like the natural continuation of who you have become. From here, even success begins taking on a different meaning. It is no longer measured only by visible accomplishment, recognition, or accumulation. Those things may still arrive, and they may still be appreciated, but they are no longer carrying the impossible burden of proving your worth. Success becomes coherence. It becomes the growing alignment between your inner understanding and your outward life. It becomes waking each day with less contradiction between what you know and how you choose to live. This coherence creates a kind of quiet abundance that circumstances alone cannot produce. You become capable of carrying peace into imperfect situations rather than postponing peace until situations become perfect. You begin contributing from fullness instead of compensation. Your generosity becomes less transactional because it is no longer trying to secure belonging. Your creativity becomes less anxious because it no longer depends entirely upon approval. Life gradually shifts from performance toward participation. People encountering you during this season may struggle to explain what feels different. They may notice that you listen more carefully than before. They may observe that you are less reactive, less hurried, and strangely difficult to manipulate through urgency or fear. They may assume you have discovered some new technique. Yet what they are actually witnessing is the accumulated effect of hundreds of quiet moments in which you remain present instead of escaping yourself. Transformation rarely announces itself. It simply becomes increasingly visible through ordinary choices repeated over time. And so the breakthrough after isolation is not a destination waiting somewhere beyond the silence. The silence itself has been shaping the very consciousness capable of recognizing the breakthrough when it arrives. Compression was never the opposite of expansion. It was expansion gathering itself into sufficient coherence to emerge without collapsing under its own possibility. Once that becomes visible, you begin seeing every season differently. Not every quiet season is asking you to withdraw forever, and not every period of pressure is preparing the same future. Yet each one carries the possibility that beneath what feels like confinement, life is patiently assembling a version of you spacious enough to inhabit realities your former self could only imagine.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.